Welcome to Dark Facade, a channel dedicated to looking past the veneer of humanity and finding its true face. I will be your tour guide down this winding path of tales, ranging from the supernatural, science fiction, and twisted love. All the stories you're about to hear are assorted bits of literature that will range from the bizarre to the unexpected. So sit back, lower the lights, and allow yourself to be taken away from everyday reality to its shadowy reflection. If you enjoy our unusual content, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button to receive more. Thank you. The Book of Dark Names by Katie Rogers, read by Katie Rogers. Chapter 9. Evelyn? Evelyn, are you listening to me? Dr. Kent's voice burrowed through the dark like a mole, sniffing about in search of her fear. Yes, the little girl answered on the verge of tears. She could almost feel him smile. I'm prepared to let you out. Do you want out, Evelyn? Do you want out of the dark? He asked, knowing that she did. Yes, I want out, she whimpered. Do you agree to be a good girl and do what I ask? I will. I will be good, she promised, desperate to be free from the tiny closet and its impenetrable darkness. Very well. I'm opening the door now. Glorious light flooded into the place, parting the darkness like the Red Sea. Christopher gently tapped Evelyn on her arm, bringing her back to the present. His blue-green eyes were filled with concern. She'd been a world away just now, and from the look on her face, it had not been a good one. Are you okay? He asked. Yes, I'm fine, she assured him. Where were you just now? He asked, as if he knew. What? Whenever you were thinking about something, like you were now, you'd get a faraway look in your eyes. So, where were you? Any place I'd know? No, and I wish I'd never known it either, she murmured. Were you back at the asylum? He asked, keeping his eyes forward. She only nodded. I never got a chance to tell you how sorry I was for what I said that night. You don't need to, Christopher, she told him. No, I want to. It was that kind of thinking that got you locked up, he said regretfully. Well, like it or not, it is precisely that kind of thinking that keeps me and my friends from being locked up in a laboratory somewhere. I suppose that's true, he smiled. Incidentally, what made you change your mind about all this? About all what? He shrugged. About me, my friends, and our abilities, not to mention a few other things you used to dismiss as superstition, nonsense, and I believe just plain bullshit, she recalled with amusement. Oh yes, that, he sighed. Well, nothing alters a cynic's view more than proof, or in my case, an experience, he replied. What sort of experience? She asked curiously. I accepted a challenge 3 years ago from a woman who ran an occult museum. I was to keep a very cursed doll in my possession for a few months and report what happened on my podcast. I remember the Edie experiment. You never really finished that. In fact, you ended your podcast and disappeared about 6 weeks in. It was shortly after that journalist friend of yours died. What was his name? Casey. His name was Casey Bellows, he said quickly. I'm sorry, Chris. We don't have to talk about this, she told him sympathetically. No, it's okay. Anyway, the doll's history was a deadly one. Whatever kind of energy was attached to it was a vengeful and angry sort. It tended to manifest in the person who had possession of it as rage. At least, that's what happened to me. What do you mean? Are you saying you experienced some sort of possession? In a manner of speaking, he shrugged. The doll was missing from my study, and I remembered hearing my daughter talking to someone upstairs. I went into her room, and I saw her with that thing in her lap. I remembered taking it away from her, and then the next thing I knew, I was holding a baseball bat over my head. My daughter was screaming in fear at my feet while holding our dog. I had kicked him several times, and he was unconscious. The bat you were holding, what were you? I'll never have to know the outcome of that, he said quickly. Julia came in and saw what was about to happen. It was her raised voice that made me drop the doll and break the connection. The gratitude in his voice was unmistakable. What happened to the doll? Evelyn asked. Some people helped me get rid of the spirit attached to it. Edie is no more, he said. So your mind was opened, she mused. Yes, and many doors, especially those within the circle that I moved in, are now closed, at least to me, he replied. Their loss is our gain. She smiled as deep affection filled her eyes. He remembered that look. It was one she would give him right before she would lean in and kiss him. Needless to say, this one was his favorite. The campus is just ahead, he announced, breaking the spell between them. Who is this guy again? Richard Phillips. He teaches here and does some research as well. What does he research? This and that, he teased. Christopher, she laughed. Physics is his field, he told her. Oh, wow, but didn't you say he specialized in ancient languages? Yeah, he does that as a hobby. He liked it so much he wrote several books on them and became an authority on the subject. He has been consulted on everything from archaeological digs to crime scenes. So he's done this kind of thing before, Evelyn surmised. Yes, many, he nodded. The car pulled into a lot located in front of a building called Temple Hall. As Evelyn walked beside Christopher to the front door, she wondered how a man as brilliant as Richard Phillips apparently was could end up in such academic obscurity. A mind like his belonged in the same lineup as Christopher had once been in. Her thoughts quickly jumped from one train to the other. When they reached the front door, the walls of most public buildings were bulging with information and secrets that they were dying to tell someone. Temple Hall was proving to be no exception. She could already hear voices calling to her before she even crossed the threshold. Countless stories of late-night rendezvous between students and professors, academic theft, failure, broken hearts, broken spirits, suicides, and every other kind of emotional train wreck one could experience on a college campus flooded her mind. Christopher had walked halfway up the hallway before realizing he was alone. Slightly puzzled, he turned around to see if Evelyn, still standing at the entrance, looking quite dazed. He had not given much thought to the effect these walls might have on her. After all, there wasn't a lot these layers of plaster and wood had not witnessed. Though he was not certain how to bring her out of this state, he took a chance by placing his hand lightly on her shoulder. His simple gesture acted like a pair of scissors, which instantly cut through the connection. Evelyn snapped back into reality with a subtle start. She stumbled forward a little, but was steadied by his hands. "Evelyn, are you all right?" he asked softly. "Yes, Christopher, thank you," she sighed while regaining her mental footing. "Do you need to wait outside? I can talk to Richard alone," he offered. "No, I'm fine. I just wasn't prepared for so much information all at once," she confessed. Anything interesting?" "Absolutely," she grinned. The two of them shared a smile that held an unspoken promise they would continue this conversation later. At that moment, they reached Richard's office, and more important matters had to be discussed. Before they stepped inside, Christopher stopped to prepare Evelyn for his friend's eccentric filing system. "Follow me closely," he cautioned, then stepped inside the door. Puzzled, Evelyn did, and soon realized the meaning behind his cryptic warning. The office was stacked, floor to ceiling, with books and files. There were entire walls made of them. Evelyn trailed Christopher as her mind began to race. She wondered what these walls might have to say about the man who currently occupied them. If it wasn't so important to listen to what he had to say, she might have let her guard down to hear them. "Hello? Anybody home?" Christopher called. "Chris, hey, come on in. You still remember the way?" Richard joked. "Yes, I think so. And I brought a friend. Her name is Dr. Evelyn Gray." "Well, welcome, Dr. Gray. I'm looking forward to seeing you," the faceless voice jested. When the two finally reached the inn, she was somewhat surprised by Dr. Phillips' appearance. He was a tall man, on the thin side, with thick black hair that he wore slicked back in a ponytail. His hazel eyes were alight with a burning curiosity, and his manner was as laid back as his choice of clothing. He was dressed in a Hawaiian-patterned shirt and blue jeans. The friendly smile he wore put Evelyn instantly at ease. "Chris, how you doing?" he greeted cheerfully while shaking his hand. "So far so good, Rick. Thank you for seeing us," Christopher replied. "Dr. Gray, how do you do?" he grinned. "Pleasure to meet you, and call me Evelyn," she smiled. "Okay, please sit down," their host invited. "So you said you have news for us?" Christopher began. "Indeed I do," Richard informed him before handing over a copy of Rashad's book. The paperback edition, which was entitled The Rule of Night, was worn with age and use. Though time had done a number on it, you could still see the cover design was meant to give it the look of an ancient work. The pitch-black color with its red wording were an unspoken warning to the darkness within the pages. "Open it to the chapters that I've marked," Richard instructed. When Christopher followed suit, he and Evelyn were struck by a familiar sight. There on each of the marked pages was the exact text found at the crime scenes. The translation of the text was printed beside it. Name after strange name of Rashad's primordial pantheon came leaping off the page. Each of the chapters that described them in their origins read like a nightmare. All of them were nothing short of bloodthirsty demons that not only encouraged and brought out the worst in human nature, they fed upon it. "So is it a safe guess that you believe these murders were not motivated by some twisted sense of justice?" Christopher asked, already knowing the answer. "In light of this new evidence? No, it wasn't. I think what we're dealing with here is a cult," Richard stated frankly. "A cult? Why do you say that?" Evelyn asked curiously. "After I figured out where the text had come from, I remembered that Nigel Rashad had based his work on a science fiction writer from the 1920s and 30s. His name was Jacob Garrison Howard. The collection of beings discussed extensively in Rashad's books were originally created by Howard. When I dug a little deeper into his background, I discovered that Howard had led a cult called Nox Eterna." "Eternal night," Evelyn murmured. Richard nodded. "So what were they about?" Christopher asked as the skeptic in him came alive again. "They wanted to free these elder gods from their prisons. According to both writers, these beings had been banished by another pantheon called the Great Old Ones. Supposedly, the two had been at war for the rights of the planet and its inhabitants for eons. The Great Old Ones prevailed and imprisoned the elder gods in different dimensions, then eradicated all practices of their religion." Evelyn rescanned the marked pages of Rashad's book that described the elder gods and their terrible rule in horrific detail. There was Hectonus, the keeper of time and knowledge; Archon, the chaotic abyss; Throg, the juggernaut; and the most disturbing of them all was a duo by the name of Khafra, goddess of blood, and Kadath, god of mayhem. Their mythos was a bloodbath from the beginning. On the day of their birth, the twin deities ate Anakas, their mother. From the carnage of her flesh, the two gained terrible power and a lust for the unspeakable. The practice of incest, murder, cannibalism, and many other abominations were commonplace in the depraved faith. Though the other gods were capable of violent destruction, this dark duo was so much more than that. The scholar in her could see the distinct parallels between these deities and those that came later. Echoes of the evil twins could be found in beings like Kali Ma, Sekhmet, Wotan, and Ares. Even the archaic practices of human sacrifice and the eating and tearing of flesh were prevalent in many long-gone religions. The descendants of these lost civilizations that had worshipped the elder gods invented others and carried on their dark legacy. "There's something else," Richard said, drawing them back into the conversation. "What is it?" Christopher asked. "I think I know why they needed these cursed artifacts," he told him. "Really? Why?" "All of them were cursed by a member of Nox Eterna." "You think these objects were cursed for a different purpose?" Christopher acknowledged. "Well, I wasn't sure until I did a little digging into each of the artifacts' histories. Turns out all of them were created and cursed by a member of Howard's cult. I think these things were being used as a way to make contact with them and perhaps receive their blessing," Richard revealed. "For example, you give them dark souls to feed upon and they grant you power. Something like extraordinary psychic abilities," Evelyn stated conclusively. "Exactly," Richard nodded. "According to the books, these sacrifices were performed to win the favor of these beings. After their banishment, however, their followers had to come up with a way to reach them. I think the dark energy trapped within these artifacts might have been the solution. Sort of like throwing chum in the water to draw sharks." "So these objects are being used to summon and gain favors from them?" Christopher asked, sounding as if he could not believe what he was saying. "Yes, but here is another catch. In order for this to really work, cultural conditions have to be just right so that they can cross back over into power," Richard replied. "What does that mean?" "He means that society at large must embrace everything negative. For example, we celebrate all things that were traditionally seen as bad: hatred, depravity, and violence." Richard nodded as Evelyn's astute accuracy. "You believe our society today is really on the brink of such destruction?" Christopher asked, slightly unnerved by their sudden acceptance. "Well, let's not forget the last time this cult tried to do this was in the 1930s. So at that time, World War II was brewing, the Nazis were in full swing, the KKK had enormous political power in the States, and the Great Depression had just about drained everyone of hope. The world was a pretty dark place, with plenty of bitterness to go around. Humanity was pretty ripe for the picking," Richard pointed out. As he listened to his friend talk, Christopher began to think about the current cultural climate. If there was any truth to what Rashad believed he could unleash, then chances were good that now was the right time for him to do it. The world at large had become a more dire place than ever before. A sudden surge of students and faculty rushing by the window outside crashed through their gloomy discussion. They might have been able to ignore the whole thing had it only been a small group, but the sheer number of people demanded attention. Several of the students had their phones out, ready to record, while the professors were urgently dialing on their own. Richard walked over to the window and lifted it up to try and get some intel. Christopher might have waited patiently in his seat had he not seen Nigel Rashad walk by. The cult leader paused just long enough to give a challenging nod to the stunned scientist. Unable to contain himself, Richard jumped up from the chair and climbed out the window. Rashad seemed amused by his opponent's determination, but he nonetheless disappeared, not into the crowd, but into thin air. Dr. Harris searched the crowd wildly, hoping he might regain sight of his target. Evelyn and Richard emerged breathless beside him as more and more people filtered by. "What the hell was that all about?" Richard panted. "Chris," Evelyn murmured as she lightly touched his hand. "There!" he shouted when he spotted Rashad 20 feet in front of them. He took off again, leading his cohorts on a wild goose chase. Rashad darted in and out of view the way one drifts in and out of consciousness. Christopher's rational mind was telling him that his quarry was just good at manipulating the crowd, but he knew better. He was disappearing and reappearing at will. Though Dr. Harris knew he was playing games, he still wanted to catch him. The chase finally came to an abrupt stop at the base of what was deemed by the university as a free zone. It was nothing more than a large concrete slab that was elevated into a stage. Rashad, who was standing less than 5 feet away now, smiled at Christopher with a twisted triumph. Though the scientist was somewhat unnerved by this, he managed to steady himself. Rashad, now certain he had Christopher's full attention, shifted his gaze toward the stage. Dr. Harris followed his eye line and immediately became submerged in the madness that was taking place. From the looks of things, it appeared that a mock execution was about to happen. All players on the platform were dressed in red hooded robes. The victim was kneeling with their hands tied behind their back in front of an all too familiar mirror. Christopher's heart skipped a beat at the sight of it. The executioner stood over the intended with axe in hand, as the third person on the stage stood at the front of the whole macabre scene, playing the part of a religious zealot from the Dark Ages. He was delivering a sermon, but not in the name of any god spoken of in modern times. "The world we live in is a delusion. The light is not who we are. We worship false idols of love and peace who tell us to suppress our true nature. Blessed is the dark and those made from it. May we be worthy to be among you. Let the blood of the corrupt open the door and let you back into our world once more. Praise to the elders. Welcome to the age of Nox Eterna." The speaker then raised his left arm in the air as a signal to the executioner to raise their axe. As his arm dropped back down to his side, the blade fell. Christopher put 2 and 2 together. This was not a mock performance. This was real. He tried desperately to push his way through the sea of people who were busy recording the whole event on their phones. He didn't get too far before he was stopped by an angry young man who had dropped and smashed his cell phone on the pavement. "Hey, you asshole, you cracked my screen," the kid yelled, jerking him back. "Look, I'm sorry, but I don't have time for this now," he retorted before turning to leave. "You better make time, dickhead," the young buck yelled before spinning him around and punching him in the face. Some who had been filming the execution stopped to film the fight that had broken out. Security finally showed up and began to wade through the crowd towards the chaos. They managed to subdue Chris's attacker in time to see the axe fall and the soul beneath it come to a bloody end. A collective gasp of horror could be heard as the axemen held up the severed head of Kaylee Moran. The terrified screams echoed the frightful shock in Christopher's mind. The speaker and executioner unmasked before the crowd, delivering yet another killer blow to the scientist. Cody stood on stage holding her mother's head while wearing a twisted smile on her face. The speaker was Brad Sterling, a young actor that Cody had been dating on and off for the past year. He knelt down to sop up some of Kaylee's blood, which was now covering the stage, then smeared it on the mirror. By this time, security had managed to fight their way through the horror-struck mob and up to the stage. Cody responded by throwing her mother's head at them and causing him to slip and fall in Katie's pool of blood. She left like a crazed psychopath, causing a surge of anger to burn through her uncle. He broke free from the clutches of the security guard and began to push his way through the assembly. To his dismay, there were plenty of people still recording the whole disgusting event with grotesque indifference. He knew Rashad was somewhere in the crowd. He just had to locate him. Almost as if the madman had read his mind, he appeared directly in front of him. "Pay close attention, Dr. Harris. You won't want to miss this," he hissed before disappearing again. The sound of glass shattering broke through the noise barrier with such force that it nearly knocked everyone to the ground. When the assembly looked towards the stage where the mirror stood, the culprit of glass appeared unharmed. The surface, however, darkened to a pitch black, and as it did so, the sun itself seemed to fade as if a great eclipse were taking place. A loud roar resonated from the bowels of the mirror, bringing a wave of terror throughout the audience. Everyone, including the security staff, were frozen in horror at the hellish sound of colossal feet and inhuman howls that came crashing through the narcissus mirror. Even though no one could see the terrible thing that had just entered their domain, they could hear it and feel it, like a deer before the wolf pounces. Yet by the looks on Cody and Brad's faces, they could plainly see the entity. They stretched their bloody hands up towards it in warped reverence before declaring the darkness was among them. Terrible shrieks erupted from each of them as they were lifted by unseen hands, then bitten in half. As what was left of the crazed duo was thrown asunder, the crowd quickly dispersed in a haze of violent panic. Christopher did his best to keep his balance while trying to help those who had been knocked down to their feet again. The invisible feed that had emerged from the mirror started running towards the crowd. Those who had been so eager to see and film death were now running from their own. Screams of terror and pain permeated the air as bodies were ripped in half like old rags. The college quad, which had once been a well-maintained patch of grass and concrete, was now a field of blood and entrails. The ground had become so saturated that it was a struggle for Christopher to keep his footing. He felt someone bump into him from behind and turned around to see a skinny frat boy recruit scurrying away. His retreat proved to be in vain, as the invisible beast punched through his chest before splitting him in two. The sickening feeling of warm blood spewing all over his face nearly made the scientist's knees buckle. Panic gripped him as he took off running again. The beast was close now, so close in fact that he could feel the earth beneath his feet shake as it pursued him. He managed to gain enough of his bearings to zero in on the student union which was just ahead. Another loud roar erupted from his monstrous prowler, reminding him just how close behind it was. As the front doors to the building got closer, a small sense of relief swept over him. The feeling was soon dashed when he tugged on the handle only to find them locked. He spun around, hoping to run to the next set of doors, but ran head first into something solid and was knocked to the ground. When he looked up, he noticed a trail of huge, bloody, inhuman footprints on the concrete that stopped short in front of him. The heated breeze he'd been feeling on his back was not the air, but the hot breath of the creature he feared. How he managed to stand to put his back against the wall was unclear, but he did. Christopher's eyes became fixated on the footprint just a few feet away. The beast had him trapped, and the terrifying truth was, it was well aware of the fact. For the first time in years, Dr. Harris was petrified. His gaze became fixated on a movement he saw in the plate glass window. He managed to make out a shape and then an image. Two huge, scaly legs with raptor-like feet were parked right where the footprints ended. From what he could tell, There were long, claw-like hands that were hanging down at its sides, and each of them was coated in flesh and blood. The reflection mercifully ended right at its hips, leaving its face a mystery. As Christopher surveyed the carnage all around him, he noticed that the beast remained curiously still. The thing had not moved in almost 5 minutes. Why? A passel of screaming sorority girls came scrambling by, which gained the monster's attention. It turned away with a loud roar before scooping up 2 of them and devoured them whole. The rest of the posse wasted no time in getting the hell out of there, and neither did he. Dr. Harris ran as fast as he could to the other set of doors, then scurried inside. "Christopher!" He turned to see Evelyn and Richard running straight for him. They were a very welcome sight. Evelyn threw her arms around his neck before kissing his cheek. Whether she did it because she was afraid or in shock, he didn't care. The softness of her embrace was comforting. He allowed himself this momentary indulgence before returning to defense mode. "We saw you running from a distance after all hell broke loose, but lost sight of you shortly afterward," Richard told him. "I'm just glad we're all right," he replied. "Did you see where Rashad went?" Evelyn asked. "The last I saw of him, he was standing next to me in the crowd. After that, I lost him." "That thing out there, what do you think it is?" Evelyn shivered. "A monster, no doubt. Or at least, that's what someone like you would call it, Dr. Gray." The small assembly turned to see Rashad standing in front of the plate-glass window, surveying the bloody chaos outside. The sci-fi altar/cult leader swung around to greet them with an unapologetic smile. The lack of remorse on his face only intensified Christopher's ire. Rashad's response was to simply disappear from where he was standing and reappear on the second-floor landing just above them, where he could get a better view of the chaos he helped unleash on the campus. The terrified screams and vicious howls of the horror outside became too much for Christopher to bear. "Why have you done this? Why have you done all of this? What is it you hope to gain?" he demanded crossly. "You know, you're truly an intellectual marvel, Doctor. A lesser mind would have dismissed the whole affair as the work of a madman. You know better, don't you? You know there's a purpose behind it all." "What is your purpose? That's the real question," Evelyn said. Rashad turned away from the massacre to meet their accusing stares with a twisted amusement in his eyes. "My dear Dr. Gray, when a simple mind such as yours looks upon the work of Throg, you only see butchery or mayhem. I, however, see truth." "Truth?" Christopher spat. "What truth?" "The truth about who we really are. Throg is an accurate reflection. Wouldn't you say?" The unsettled looks on their faces said it all for him. "Oh, I understand. Like you, I was preconditioned to believe that as a general rule, people were good. Only a small percentage of us were bad, or as some hacks of science would have you believe, merely disturbed. What we are is strung across the green outside, lovers of gore, disciples of anarchy." "You can't be serious," Christopher gasped. "Oh, but I am," the madman declared. "How can you believe such a thing with all the evidence to the contrary?" Evelyn asked. "What evidence would that be, Dr. Gray? Would I find it in our love of genocide, slavery, or perhaps our war upon war in the name of false gods and greed?" "Yes, evil exists. Nothing proves that better than what you've unleashed outside," Evelyn countered. "Please, Dr. Gray, take a look at the more subtle picture. The truth is often found there than anywhere else. Observe Throg. His work is not so random." Against their better judgment, the trio of scientists took his dare and watched the bloodbath outside. Upon first glance, Throg seemed to be a mindless killing machine. There didn't appear to be any rhyme or reason to his destruction. That was how it appeared until the Juggernaut cornered two people, an older librarian-type woman and a middle-aged professor. It was clear to the both of them that Throg had them trapped. They could smell his hot, bloody breath and see his monstrous footprints just a few feet away. Why the beast was standing there was anyone's guess, but they both knew eventually it would kill them. "Now watch," Rashad ordered as he felt the tension building. Almost as if on cue, the professor pushed the old woman towards the creature, then made a break for it. Throg's decision became easy as he scooped the running coward up and devoured him whole. The team of scientists watched him disappear into the invisible jaws, bit by horrifying bit, until the only trace of him was the blood and tissue matter on the pavement. He waited to see what they would do, Evelyn murmured in a daze. He waited to see which one was worse, Richard concluded. "Very good, Dr. Phillips. You understand perfectly," Rashad gushed. "Are you trying to say that this thing is some sort of deranged sin-eater?" Christopher scoffed. "Think of him as being one with discerning taste. The man was the prime rib to the lady's chopped steak." "Meaning what?" Christopher demanded. "Meaning the darker the soul, the more satisfying to his hunger," Richard explained. "Hole in one, Dr. Phillips," Rashad praised. "The cursed objects, the corrupt victims, did they play a similar role in all this?" Christopher asked. "Of course. It's like Dr. Phillips said, chum in the water," Rashad confirmed. Even though the madman had not been present during their conversation, not one of them were surprised by his assurances of Richard's theories. Christopher's notable silence brought a spiteful grin to Rashad's face. "Galls, doesn't it, Dr. Harris?" he needled. "What do you mean by that?" Christopher challenged. "Discovering that your family was not at all what they appeared to be. It's so hard to have our illusions shattered by the truth, especially when the truth is written in blood." The scientist met the madman's gloating stare with quiet hostility. "That's enough, Rashad," Evelyn snapped angrily. "Oh, don't misunderstand, Dr. Gray. I owe much of my success to them, especially Kaylee," he said maliciously. "All right, you've gotten your massacre. One way or another, it will come to an end, and you will pay for it. So tell me, what have you really achieved?" Christopher demanded. "You still don't get it, do you, Dr. Harris?" Rashad sighed in disappointment. "Get what?" he growled impatiently. "Throg is just the beginning. Throg will make the path with blood, and let the dark in," Richard recited in a voice threaded with horror. "Once again you prove yourself quite the scholar, Professor Phillips," Rashad praised. "That's what this mayhem is all about? This is how the others will be unleashed?" The tone in Christopher's voice was as grim as the terror outside. Rashad stared back at him in triumph before answering his question. "Look at it this way, Dr. Harris. At least there will be gods you cannot deny," he joked darkly. "These are not gods. They're what you called them before. Monsters," Evelyn declared. "Oh no, they're much more than that, Dr. Gray. They are what we truly deserve," Rashad argued. "You think that what is going on out there right now is what mankind deserves?" Richard inquired, completely dumbfounded. "Yes," the madman hissed. "That is not your decision to make," Christopher shouted. "My decision? Oh, this was not just my decision. I could not have carried this out without the full cooperation of all humanity. We wear our masks of civility, righteousness, and reason, but that's not who we are. Beneath the surface is our true identity. Savages that hunger for death, wantons of destruction, and ghouls with a taste for blood. I will bring back the gods we deserve, the monsters that reflect us best. The calm that had been Rashad's armor was now in fragments as rage overtook him. What was even more frightening was how the light seemed to retreat the more his anger grew. The brightness faded to almost nothing, leaving only the dim in its wake. Rashad himself seemed to become a shadow. His face darkened to the point that his eyes were like beacons in the night. Evelyn moved closer to her companions as the walls began to call out to her like frightened children. They were telling her to run. Something terrible was on its way, and she needed to hurry. The panic in their voices filled her with such dread that her heart began to race. It began to pound so loudly she was certain that Rashad could hear it. When she saw the vicious smile on his face, she knew he could. She placed a trembling hand on Christopher's fingers to gain his attention. The anger drained from his eyes when he saw the fear in hers. "What is it, Evelyn?" he asked earnestly. "We have to go, Chris. We have to go now," she replied anxiously. "Why?" "I don't know. The walls, they're telling me to run," she answered desperately. "Oh no, Dr. Gray, don't leave yet. You need to see this. You need to be a witness," Rashad declared. "Just what is it we are to witness?" Christopher asked suspiciously. "The future," Rashad announced. The sound of shattering glass cut through the intensity of the moment with such sharpness that it briefly scrambled their senses. An ear-blasting roar thundered throughout the lobby so loudly that the rest of the entryway glass cascaded down in a fountain of shards. Throg was now among them, and even though the walls were screaming for them to run, they dared not move an inch. The strange part was how calm Rashad appeared in the midst of such destruction. His eyes were closed in such a way that he appeared to be making peace with something. Christopher also noticed sets of black inhuman footprints that started at the shards of glass and led towards their deranged host. He surmised that Throg must have cut himself on the broken glass and was now bleeding. The thunderous sound of the creature's footsteps came to an abrupt stop in front of Rashad. His eyes popped open and became consumed with unspeakable fear at what he saw. His anxiety was short-lived, however, and was replaced instead with a vindictive grin. He then tipped his head in a foreboding goodbye before saying, "The darkness is upon you, Doctor. You can't stop it now." After his declaration, Throg, the invisible destruction, tore him apart and devoured him whole.